This is a look at what we're going to build in this upcoming set of videos. We're going to build a running tracker application where the user can log each day how many miles they have ran. So for example, we could add a value for today, such as 1.9, and this is then added to the end of this array. Each day we can add a value, and we'll record the values for the last 7 days. So each time we add a value, it will replace any of these placeholders. Let's add a new one inside of here, and these are all pushed off the edge here, so we get the latest 7 days. Scrolling down, we have an area where we can check out all of our stats, such as the total which we ran in this particular week, the average distance, and also the highest recorded value for this particular week. Right at the very bottom, we can also add a target inside the code where we can say how many miles we want to run for that particular week. This is then updated each time we add a new value, and then we see this nice progress circle down at the bottom. Let's add a new value, and this is then added to our total and also updating the progress circle. We're going to start in this video by creating the user interface with HTML, and to do this we can also use this image up at the top, which is an SVG. You can of course find your own, but if you want to use the same one which I'm using in the course, head over to this link on GitHub. This is chrisdixon161 and then /fun-javascript-projects.com. In this repository you'll find all of the finished code for each one of these projects. If you head into the running tracker, you will also see a runner.svg. To use this inside of our project, we'll need to click on the code icon. And this is the code which we'll need just here. So we're going to now begin by creating our project, and we'll come back to this very soon. So let's go over to the desktop. I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to name this the running tracker. Open up Visual Studio Code, and then we can drag over our project. The first thing we need is to create an index.html page. This is going to be for our user interface. So let's create a new file inside of our folder. This is the index.html. And if you're using Visual Studio Code, you can make use of the shortcut, which is HTML:5, and hit enter. This will then give us our starting point for our HTML page. And we can also open this up in the browser by clicking on the tab, copy the path, and then paste this inside of the browser. As always, you can double click on the index.html file, which is also contained inside of our project folder. So working from the very top, we're going to include this SVG right at the very start. And to do this, I'm going to create a div section, which is going to have the class of logo. Inside of this section, we can now make use of our SVG. So copy the code from GitHub, paste this in. Moving down, the next thing we need for our project is the input section. We're going to create this with a label and then a number input, and then a button to submit this form. So just below our logo section, or the wrapper div, create our form. We also don't need the action. We're going to begin with a label. This label is going to be for an input with the ID of entry, and then the text is going to be number of miles today. You can also change this to be kilometers or any other value which you want to use. That's completely fine too, and it won't affect this application. A break tag to put this onto a new line, and then our input, which is going to have the type of number. The ID of entry, which is going to match our label, and then a step attribute of 0.1. This means our values inside of the number input will increase by the value of 0.1. After this, a new break tag, so we can then add our submit button. So the button needs the type of submit, which will allow this to submit our form. At the moment, we don't have any JavaScript in place to take advantage of the numbers which the user inputs, but for now we can add these dashes as placeholder values. We're going to do this by creating a wrapper for this section, creating an unordered list, And each one of these values is going to be a list item. So below our form, a horizontal rule just to divide this section, the section elements, and the class, so we can use this inside of the CSS, is going to be the entries wrapper. The title of last 7 days. As we just mentioned, an unordered list to store all of these values. This can also have an ID, so we can target this inside of JavaScript. So for now, our placeholder values are simply going to be a dash. And since we are working with the previous 7 days, I'm going to duplicate this to create 7 list items. And let's check this out. Next, we have a data section, which is going to be all of the stats for our application. So we're going to create a section and 3 separate divs. And each one of these divs is going to have a title and also a value. We can also wrap this in a new section in our HTML. This section can have a class of data, and then our first div for our total section. For each one of these titles on the left, I'm going to wrap this in a p element, and then a span over on the right. The first p is for the text of total, and then a colon. The first span, you can either leave this empty or put in a placeholder value. This will also need an ID, so we can update this in JavaScript. After this div, we can then concentrate on our average distance section. A new div, the p element, and the text for this one is average distance. The span for this one is also going to have a unique ID. This is going to be the average. And again, you can also add a placeholder number, but this is completely optional. The third section is for the weekly high value. So our p element with this week's high. Our span with the ID, which is going to be high. And then a default value. Let's take a look at this. Most of the user interface is now in place, but we just need to take a look at the bottom and then add our progress circle. So a lot of this progress circle is going to be dependent on the JavaScript and also the CSS, which we'll add in future videos. But for now, we can create a label and also a div section, so we can use this later on in the course. So the final section down at the very bottom, we can add a class of progress. And then our level 3 heading up at the top, which is weekly target. This weekly target section is going to have also 2 separate values. So we'll have the total number of miles for this particular week, and then also a slash followed by the target. So to do this, I'm going to add 2 separate span elements. The first one, this is going to have an ID of progress total, a placeholder value of 0. After the span, add a forward slash, and then a second span element. Let's add a default value of 25, and also an ID which is going to be equal to target. After both of these spans, we also need to add the text of miles right at the very end after our last span. Let's just add these onto the own lines so it's more readable. There we go. And also make sure that all of this is contained inside of the level 3 heading. Save and reload the browser. We have a heading, and the very last thing to do below the level 3 heading is to add a new div which is going to be for our progress circle. So we can add this just with a class of progress circle wrapper. As we mentioned earlier, we don't need to do anything else with this section. This is simply going to be a placeholder div. We'll deal with this later on using CSS and also JavaScript. So for now, we'll call this video done. Our user interface is now in place. And in the next video, we'll make it look a lot nicer using CSS.